The rain didn't just fall that morning. It poured like a reckoning. Sheets of water crashed against the windows of Terminal 3 at Hamilton International, blurring the view of grounded planes and turning the tarmac into a shimmering, slate-colored ocean. Inside, the terminal hummed with a subdued tension, the atmosphere that builds when delays stack like dominoes and time loses its structure. Passengers slouched in rows of seats, necks craned toward departure boards glowing with the word delayed repeated like a curse. Gate B29 was quiet. The storm had grounded more than flights. It had grounded conversation, movement, even hope. That kind of stillness always came before something changed, something important. It arrived on four legs with a soft click of claws on tile and the faint shuffle of small feet behind it. Click, click, click. The sound turned a few heads, but most looked away, uninterested or too tired to care. They missed the significance of what they were witnessing. But someone didn't. Sandra Pierce, the gate agent on duty, glanced up from her tablet and frowned. She'd worked for the airline for nearly 12 years and considered herself sharp, no nonsense, and by the book. Her uniform was crisp, her smile practiced, and her tone was always just a little too loud. She didn't tolerate disruption, and to her, that sound, those approaching footsteps, already smelled like trouble. She saw the girl first, small, pale, wrapped in a raincoat 2 sizes too big, sleeves swallowing her hands, hood pulled halfway down. Her sneakers were soaked, leaving a faint trail of water behind her. But it was her eyes that arrested Sandra's attention. Not for their color, which was a stormy gray, but for their expression. Tired, watchful, wiser than they should be for a girl who looked no older than 12. And walking beside her was a dog. Not a small, purse-sized lapdog, not the kind bred for cuteness or comfort. This was a Belgian Malinois, sleek, strong, and alert. The dog moved with purpose, not prancing, not distracted. His gait was steady, his body poised. His name, stitched into the side of his black harness, was Shadow. The girl clutched the handle of his harness like it was a lifeline. Sandra's frown deepened. She stood up, straightened her name badge, and stepped away from the counter. The girl and Shadow moved toward a quiet corner of the waiting area, the dog instinctively positioning himself just ahead of her, scanning the space. He was a barrier, a guardian. Anyone who looked closely enough could see it. But Sandra didn't see protection. She saw policy violations. "Excuse me," she called out, stepping directly into the girl's path. Her voice was firm, louder than necessary. "You can't bring that dog into this area without proper documentation." The girl stopped. Her fingers tightened around the harness. Shadow, sensing the change, froze beside her, gaze fixed, body unmoving. "I have it," the girl whispered, reaching into the inner pocket of her raincoat. Her hands shook slightly as she pulled out a laminated ID card and extended it with care. Sandra didn't even glance at it. Instead, she folded her arms and leaned slightly forward, her tone taking on a sharp edge. "Look, I don't care what kind of card you have. We have policies here. Large dogs are not allowed unless they're real service animals." The word real landed like a slap. The girl looked down. "He is," she said softly. Sandra's lips twitched with something between disbelief and annoyance. She raised her voice, projecting it toward the few passengers close enough to hear. "You can't just bring your pet in here and expect special treatment." At that word, pet, Shadow's ears flicked, and the girl's cheeks flushed crimson. Still, she said nothing. She just stood there, shrinking slightly beneath Sandra's gaze. But the dog didn't shrink. Shadow held firm. He was unmoved by authority, unshaken by aggression. He stood like he had done this before, like he had guarded her from worse. Sandra narrowed her eyes. "You people always think the rules don't apply to you?" That was when the shift happened. Not in the air, but in the silence that followed. The girl lifted her chin, just slightly. Enough for anyone watching closely to see that something inside her had steeled. Her mouth trembled, but her eyes didn't waver. "My name is Lana Brooks," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but anchored with surprising firmness. "Shadow is my service dog. He's trained to detect seizures before they happen. I have epilepsy." Sandra rolled her eyes. "And I have rules. Take it up with security." She turned sharply, raising her hand to flag down an airport security officer. Lana didn't protest. She didn't cry. She simply took one slow breath and reached down, placing her small hand on Shadow's back. He pressed into her gently, as if reminding her she wasn't alone. The guard ambled over, uninterested, scanning his badge. Sandra launched into a list of complaints: unauthorized animal, safety concerns, and possible allergy risks. Her voice was loud, theatrical. A few nearby passengers began watching more closely now. Lana extended the laminated card again. "She can't fly without him," Julia Brooks, Lana's mother, called out as she jogged toward them, breathless, a tote bag slung over one shoulder. "We've submitted the documentation twice. He's listed on the ticket." Sandra sneered. "Then you'll need to rebook. The captain won't allow it." Julia stopped in her tracks. "Please, we're flying to Chicago for a medical consult. We've been planning this trip for months." Sandra offered a tight smile. "Then you should have planned better." The line was cruel in its precision. Lana didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood there, her hand still resting on Shadow's back, her eyes focused, not on Sandra, not on the guard, but on some distant point beyond them, a place where she wasn't being judged, a place where people like her were seen. And Shadow, always watching, always present, shifted his weight just slightly. He felt it coming. No one else did, not yet. But the storm inside was building. Shadow sensed it first, before the voices got sharper, before the stance of the security guard shifted from disinterest to assertion, before Lana's small shoulders curled inward like a paper cup crushed at the edges. The tension in the air had changed. It had thickened. He leaned closer into Lana's side, his powerful body touching hers most gently, as if to say, "I've got you." But just a few feet away, Sandra Pierce smiled with satisfaction. A smile not of resolution, but of domination. "Captain Hale is on his way," she said to the security officer beside her. "He'll handle it." Lana looked up. "Please," she said quietly. "Shadow hasn't hurt anyone. He's flown with me 3 times already." He curls up under the seat. "He's trained. He knows how to behave." The guard crossed his arms. "Ma'am, we understand. But the final say rests with the flight crew. And if they say no, there's nothing we can do." Nothing we can do. The 4 most convenient words in any bureaucracy. Julia Brooks, still catching her breath, stepped forward. "Let me talk to the captain directly," she said, trying to stay calm. "I have all of our documents printed. I even have his emergency medical directive from Lana's neurologist." Sandra waved her off without even a glance. "He doesn't take parent appeals. We go by protocol." Lana turned slightly, enough to see the cluster of passengers nearby. Most had resumed staring at their phones, murmuring to each other. One man tilted his head just enough to see, but not enough to be considered involved. A woman with a toddler tugged her child closer and whispered something into his ear. A businessman glanced over the top of his newspaper with fleeting judgment, then disappeared behind it again. No one stepped forward. Lana tightened her grip on Shadow's harness. That's when the sound came. Heavy, sure steps cutting through the silence. Polished black shoes on polished white tile. Captain Raymond Hale. He looked every bit the part, tall, rigid, square-jawed, the kind of man you'd see on an airline poster with a tagline like, "Trust in Experience." His uniform was immaculate, wings polished, collar straight, expression unreadable. He walked with purpose toward the scene, flanked by authority, dripping with the kind of confidence that came from decades of never being questioned. As he approached, Sandra stepped aside like a loyal deputy. "That's the girl," she whispered, "and that's the dog." Hale didn't even look at Lana at first. His eyes swept the crowd, noting the onlookers. 1 or 2 phones had already been raised, not recording yet, but poised, curious. He seemed to clock that, then turned back to Lana and Shadow with practiced neutrality. "By airline safety regulations," he began, "this animal is too large to safely be accommodated in the cabin. He poses an obstruction risk in case of evacuation." Lana blinked. "He's flown before. He fits under the seat. He knows to stay still." "Even so," Hale said, "I'm not willing to jeopardize cabin safety. Regulations exist for a reason. We do not make exceptions." The emphasis on the last sentence was no accident. Julia stepped forward, her hands trembling but firm. "Sir, With all due respect, what you're doing right now is the exception. You're denying a disabled child access to necessary medical assistance during a flight. That dog is part of her treatment plan. Hale's face didn't move. You're free to rebook for a later flight once accommodations can be made. It took us 3 months to get this appointment, Julia said. Lana's neurologist only flies in from Boston once a quarter. If she misses this, she could go weeks without adjusted medication. Hale simply repeated, "The animal will not board this flight." A silence fell, not just between the characters, but throughout the gate. It was the kind of silence that crackles, not from stillness, but from suppressed protest, from all the words people think but don't say aloud. Lana looked up at the captain, her small figure dwarfed by his towering posture. "If I have a seizure on the flight," she said quietly, "Shadow will know before anyone else. He can warn the crew. He can brace me. He can stop me from hitting my head." Hale looked unmoved. Then came the final line. "You have two choices," he said flatly. "Board the flight without the dog, or don't board at all." Julia closed her eyes, grief radiating across her face like heat. Lana felt it in her mother's posture. Resignation. Not from defeat, but from the terrible familiarity of it all. The sense that no matter how well prepared you were, no matter how justified your case, there would always be someone who saw your difference as a burden. The guard didn't speak. Sandra folded her arms, lips curled in smug victory. Lana looked down at Shadow. He was staring directly at Captain Hale, unmoving, his dark eyes steady, not aggressive, not defensive, just watching. "I guess I don't get to be safe today," Lana whispered. And then something happened. Not big, not loud, but undeniable. Shadow moved closer. He pressed his head gently against Lana's hand, then turned to stand between her and the captain. Not in threat, in a statement. "This girl is mine. I am hers. And if you cannot see her, then see me." And it worked. Because a man in a gray hoodie near the back muttered, "This isn't right." A woman at the vending machine stopped, mid-selection. Another mother, this time with a baby strapped to her chest, took a tentative step forward. Lana noticed, but said nothing, because her heart had already begun to tremble, not from fear, but from something she didn't expect. Resolve. The captain had spoken. His voice, flat and final, still hung in the air, like the aftershock of a slammed door. "The animal will not board this flight." It was meant to end the conversation, to remind everyone of where authority stood. But instead, it had cracked something open. Lana stood still, not because she agreed, not because she surrendered, but because she understood something the others didn't yet. When someone tells you there's no space for you, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand your ground anyway. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She simply placed her hand firmly on Shadow's back and let the silence deepen. That silence was heavy, oppressive even, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with glances, some sympathetic, others unsure. A murmur ran through the passengers gathered at Gate B29, subtle but building. One woman whispered, "She's just a kid." A man nearby muttered, "That's a service dog, not a pet. There are laws." But the people with the power weren't listening. Sandra Pierce, arms crossed, still wore her satisfaction like perfume. Strong, bitter, and impossible to ignore. She didn't see Lana as a child. She saw her as an inconvenience that needed to be removed before boarding began. An obstacle wrapped in a raincoat tethered to a four-legged rule breaker. Julia Brooks took a slow step forward, her voice low but firm. "Captain Hale, please. My daughter needs her dog. He's not a comfort animal. He's medical, and the law's on our side." But Hale didn't flinch. "Ma'am, I've made my decision. We're not going to debate this in front of a crowd." "You already are," someone called from the seats behind them. That voice startled everyone. It belonged to a man in a navy suit, previously buried in his phone. Now he was standing. "She has a legal right to board. You're denying access to a child with a disability. That's not a debate. It's a violation." Captain Hale's jaw flexed. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat." But it was too late. The illusion of control had already begun to fracture. More voices rose. Another woman, older, with silver hair and eyes filled with fire, stood beside the man. "If this is how you treat people who need help," she said sharply, "I'd like to know what else your airline is willing to overlook." Hale turned, trying to reassert command, but the energy had shifted. The crowd no longer saw Lana as a problem. They saw her as a person, but Lana didn't look at them. She was still focused on one thing: Shadow. The dog hadn't moved an inch. His body was a statue of calm, his focus entirely on her. But there was a slight twitch in his ears, a shift in his stance, subtle but unmistakable. He was sensing something, a warning. Lana's fingers twitched on the harness. "Mom," she said quietly. Julia looked down at her, immediately alert. "What is it, baby?" "I think—" Lana's voice trailed off. Shadow stepped closer, his muzzle nudging her leg. His whole body seemed to grow more still, more intentional. He was sounding the alarm. Julia's eyes widened. She'd seen this before. "Captain Hale," she began, her voice urgent. "She's about to have a seizure." But Hale, still trying to address the building crowd, didn't even look at her. "We need medical—" Julia tried again, but her sentence was cut short by a sudden movement. Lana's body went rigid. Her knees buckled. Shadow lunged. With the precision of a soldier, the dog maneuvered beneath her just as she collapsed. His body absorbed the fall, cushioning her as her small frame began to seize. His head cradled her skull, blocking it from the tile floor. His paws braced around her arms. The entire terminal froze. Passengers gasped. Phones dropped. Conversations stopped mid-breath. The storm outside the windows still howled. But now the true storm was inside. Julia dropped to her knees, cradling her daughter's twitching body, tears streaking her face. "Lana, baby, I'm here. I'm here." Shadow stayed completely still, his chest rising and falling in deep, controlled breaths. He nudged her gently, his body low and protective. Not frantic, not barking. He knew exactly what to do. And he did it. A woman screamed for help. The man in the Navy suit pulled out his phone. Not to record, but to call 911. A teenager dropped his backpack and ran toward the gate agent's desk, yelling for paramedics. People moved now, not away, but toward responsibility, toward shame. Sandra stood frozen, clipboard clutched like a shield. Captain Hale stepped back, his face pale. He didn't say a word, because no words could fix what had just happened. The girl they had tried to remove, the dog they had called a hazard, had just proven, with brutal, undeniable clarity, that he was the only one in the room who had done everything right. Shadow didn't tremble. As Lana's small body convulsed gently beneath him, he stayed rock steady, his limbs taut, his breath measured, his head low and firm against her shoulder. His muscles absorbed her weight, his eyes tracked every twitch. He was trained for this moment. But more than that, he was made for it. A shield not of steel, but of instinct, duty, and devotion. And now he was the only barrier between her and disaster. A medic team rushed in seconds later, flanked by airport security and airline staff, who minutes ago had stood in passive silence. The lead EMT, a woman with a braided streak of gray hair and eyes like flint, slowed as she approached. She'd seen service animals before. She knew what she was dealing with. "Easy," she murmured gently, lowering herself to Shadow's level. "You're doing your job. We're here to help." Shadow didn't growl, didn't snap, but his gaze didn't leave her face. Not until Lana's breathing began to level, just barely. Then slowly, cautiously, he stepped aside, only a little, never fully relinquishing his post. The paramedics moved fast. Oxygen mask, heart monitor, BP cuff. Every beep and tube and clamp added proof to the truth no one could deny now. This was real, not a tantrum, not entitlement, not manipulation, a child in medical crisis. And the one creature who had responded before anyone else had been the one they tried to ban. The crowd watched in stunned silence. The whispers were gone now, replaced by a heaviness, a reckoning. Those who had clutched their children tighter, who had rolled their eyes or snapped quiet judgments, now stared at Lana and Shadow as though they were seeing something sacred, something broken and beautiful. Julia Brooks sat beside her daughter, hand gripping Lana's cold fingers, her eyes red and raw with a mother's helpless fury. "You saw what he did," she said to no one and everyone at once. Her voice cracked, but she didn't care. "You all saw what he did." No one answered, but they had. Even Captain Hale. He stood a few feet away, his jaw tight, arms limp at his sides. Earlier he had looked invincible, upright, commanding, a man certain of his rightness. Now he looked small, a statue no longer made of granite, but of cracked porcelain, polished on the outside, crumbling beneath. Shadow lay beside Lana again, his broad body curled into hers, his nose gently nudging her hand. As the monitor beeped softly with her shallow breaths, he never once looked away. Then came the sound, clapping, not loud, not mocking. One person near the back. A woman who had earlier pulled her child away from the dog now stood with tears glistening on her cheeks. Her hands came together once. Then again, another passenger joined in, then another, not a standing ovation, not performative, but a slow, soft tribute to Lana, to Shadow, to truth that couldn't be regulated out of sight. Sandra Pierce shrank into herself, her arms wrapped so tightly across her chest that it looked like she was holding back pieces of herself. She glanced toward Captain Hale as if silently begging for reinforcement. He gave none, because he was no longer sure what he was defending. The first officer, Eli Navarro, stood just beyond the crowd. He hadn't said a word since the incident began, but his expression was steel, a quiet, controlled judgment. Not smug, not accusatory, just clear. Like someone who had seen enough to know when something had gone too far. And it had. The paramedics began prepping Lana for transport, not out of the terminal, but onto the plane. Now re-cleared, now properly arranged. Julia walked beside them, one hand still in her daughter's, the other guiding Shadow's harness. That's when Captain Hale spoke again. His voice, though still even, was different now. Lower, stripped of authority, like someone realizing he had handed a loaded weapon to his ego. "The dog may board," he said. A ripple moved through the terminal. "But," he added quickly, reaching for any remaining thread of control, "he must remain directly beside her the entire flight. He cannot obstruct any aisle, not under any circumstances." It was an order posed as a compromise, a final grasp at power, but no one argued, because no one needed to. Shadow had already obeyed a law far greater than airline policy, the law of loyalty. Julia didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. Gratitude wasn't owed for a wrong begrudgingly righted. She simply nodded once and turned her focus back to her daughter. The boarding gate opened, passengers remained seated, not out of confusion, out of reverence. They watched as Lana, half-conscious but stable, was wheeled slowly down the jet bridge. Shadow at her side, walking in step, as he always had. The dog they'd called an inconvenience, the girl they'd called a problem, now led the way. The boarding process that followed was unlike any the gate had seen before. There were no impatient lines, no scrambling for overhead space, no frantic checks of seat numbers. Instead, there was a hush, a reverent stillness that wrapped around Gate B29 like fog. No one moved until Lana moved, and even then, they moved only to step aside. She was still pale, her breathing shallow beneath the oxygen mask. A medic guided her wheelchair carefully down the jet bridge, flanked by a silent escort of staff who, minutes ago, had been indifferent at best. Julia walked beside her, her hand never leaving Lana's arm, and right at her feet, moving in perfect synchronization, was Shadow, steady, quiet, eyes forward. The dog who had saved her, the dog who had been nearly kept off the flight. Shadow's head stayed level, his body pressed close to Lana's chair, like gravity itself had rewired to pull them together. He didn't glance at the onlookers, but the onlookers couldn't stop watching him. Inside the aircraft, a seat had been cleared. Bulkhead, row 2A. Extra space for Shadow to lie safely at Lana's feet. An oxygen unit was already clipped in. A folded blanket was placed neatly nearby. It wasn't much, but it was something. A quiet gesture from a cabin crew now fully aware of how close they'd come to letting something irreversible happen. The first officer, Eli Navarro, watched from the cockpit doorway as they boarded. He gave a single respectful nod to Julia, who returned it without a word. When Lana was carefully transferred into her seat and Shadow curled himself into place beside her, something shifted in the cabin. The air changed. People didn't settle into their seats with the usual sighs and stretching limbs. They sat with intention, with awareness, with weight. Across the aisle, a woman who had earlier pulled her son away from Shadow now whispered gently to the child, pointing quietly at the dog and mouthing, "He's a hero." The boy nodded solemnly. In row 3, an older man with a Vietnam veteran cap removed it as they passed. Not out of obligation, but respect. Captain Hale remained in the cockpit. He hadn't emerged since he gave the final reluctant order. "The dog may board." His voice still echoed in his mind, strained, exposed. And now each beep from the portable monitor strapped to Lana's arm played like a metronome in his guilt. How close had he come? How close had his decision, his inflexibility, his clinging to control, come to causing irreparable harm? Back in row 9, a woman reached for her phone to tweet about what she had witnessed, then paused, then lowered it again. Words wouldn't do justice to what they'd seen. It wasn't a moment designed for virality. It was one meant to be remembered in the bones, not just the timeline. The cabin lights dimmed. The seatbelt sign clicked on. And for a long, drawn-out moment before takeoff, no one spoke. Only Lana stirred. Her lips moved beneath the oxygen mask, soft, barely forming the syllables. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice ragged but sure. Shadow's ears twitched. He leaned his head up from where it rested on the floor, then gently nuzzled her hand. He had been told he didn't belong. He had been called a safety risk. Now he was the only reason she was still breathing. The plane began to taxi, a gentle lurch, a low hum. Shadow didn't flinch. Not when the engines roared, not when the wheels lifted off the ground. Not when turbulence jerked the cabin just enough to make even seasoned travelers glance nervously toward the overhead compartments. Shadow stayed where he was, anchored to her, not the floor. As the aircraft climbed into thick gray clouds, the weight of what had happened remained. Passengers didn't reach for magazines. They watched. They remembered. And for the first time in a long time, they understood. The rules they had trusted without question weren't always built for justice. Sometimes they were built for control. And sometimes that control needed to be broken. Julia adjusted the blanket around Lana's shoulders, her movements slow and methodical. She whispered something in her daughter's ear. Lana didn't reply, but the corner of her lips lifted. Barely. It was enough. The young flight attendant, the same one who had looked away earlier at the gate, now approached with trembling hands. She knelt quietly beside Shadow and reached out, not to pet, but simply to be present. Her fingers touched his back gently. "You're doing great, buddy," she said. "Better than any of us." Shadow gave no sign that he heard her, but he didn't pull away either. It was enough. At 33,000 feet, above the storm that still raged below, Lana drifted into shallow sleep. The monitor at her side beeped in soft, rhythmic certainty. Shadow didn't sleep, not even for a second. The plane flew in silence. Not the ordinary silence of a late-night flight, with passengers dozing and the engine hum filling the void. This silence was different. It was thoughtful, heavy, woven with things unspoken. Regret, awe, and something deeper still, change. Flight 227 was somewhere over Ohio now, cruising through calm skies above the storm it had left behind. But for those aboard, especially those seated near row 2, the turbulence had not passed. Lana slept lightly, her fingers curled into the thick fur at Shadow's neck. She stirred now and then, just enough to remind her mother that she was still with them. The oxygen mask remained secure. The monitor beside her beeped steadily, like the heartbeat of something still fragile, but enduring. Shadow hadn't moved in for over an hour. His posture was perfect, alert, yet calm. His head rested just beside Lana's legs. Every few minutes, he would lift his nose to her hand, confirming she was still stable. Then, with that same grace and gravity he had shown all along, he'd lower his head again and resume his watch. Across the aisle, passengers stole glances, some openly, some shyly. Their eyes lingered on the girl in the window seat, in the dog who had not left her side. They weren't gawking. They were witnessing. Not a spectacle, but a kind of sacred resilience. Toward the rear of the cabin, the woman with the silver hair, who had clapped first at the gate, now held her husband's hand tightly. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Their silence wasn't complicity, it was reverence. Near the galley, Eli Navarro stood beside the beverage cart, arms folded loosely, eyes toward the cockpit. His mind hadn't left Gate B29. His body had taken off, but part of him was still standing there, watching a child seize on cold tile, while the people in power froze. He knew what Captain Hale had seen, and what it had cost him to admit it. Hale sat in his command chair now, hands loosely gripping the armrests. His gaze was forward, but his mind was behind, looping, rewinding, replaying. He had followed protocol. He had quoted safety standards. He had done what the manual said, and still he had been wrong. He thought of the way Shadow had moved, silent and certain, shielding Lana without waiting for permission. He thought of Lana's voice, cracked but defiant, saying, "I guess I don't get to be safe today." That sentence hadn't left him. It clung to his spine like frost. Captain Hale wasn't a cruel man, but he had become something just as dangerous, detached. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing people. He had started seeing categories, codes, exceptions, risks, not lives, not children, not service dogs who saved them. Now, sitting just feet from the girl he had tried to leave behind, he felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel. Shame, not the loud kind, not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind that lodges behind the ribs and won't let go, the kind that breaks things open. Behind him, a low ding sounded, the seatbelt sign lighting up. A patch of turbulence was expected ahead. Hale didn't reach for the intercom. He couldn't, not yet, because at that very moment, Lana stirred again. She blinked slowly, still half asleep, and let out a soft sound, like a question asked without words. Shadow was already there. He lifted his head, nudged her fingers, then placed his chin on the edge of her lap, calm and steady. Lana smiled faintly, and for just a second in that flickering moment between sleep and pain, she looked toward the cockpit, toward the man who had once told her she didn't belong. Her eyes didn't carry hatred. They carried something else, a kind of quiet knowing, as if to say, "You saw me now, whether you wanted to or not." The plane jolted slightly as it hit the edge of the predicted turbulence. Passengers stiffened. Trays rattled. A child whimpered somewhere near the back. But in row 2, there was no fear. Shadow braced himself, adjusting his body to absorb the motion before Lana even noticed it. And when she did notice, when her eyelids fluttered open and the lights above buzzed softly, she didn't panic. She reached for Shadow's fur, and he was already there, solid, present, hers. Julia wiped at her daughter's forehead with a tissue. "You're doing okay," she whispered. "We're in the air. You're safe." Lana didn't answer. She was too tired, but her hand tightened in Shadow's coat, and that said everything. The turbulence passed. The silence returned. But something had changed. Back in the cockpit, Captain Hale leaned forward and pressed his fingers together slowly, like a man trying to warm hands that had grown cold. Then, for the first time since takeoff, he reached for the intercom. His voice came on low, controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've just passed through some mild turbulence and expect a smooth remainder of the flight. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for your understanding." He paused. A beat longer than normal. A silence. A choice. Then he clicked off the mic. He didn't need to say more. The cabin was already understood. Sometimes the deepest apologies aren't delivered through speeches. They're made visible by change. And across the aisle, Shadow thumped his tail once, softly against the floor. A gesture small enough to miss, unless you were paying attention. At cruising altitude, the cabin lights dimmed into a quiet glow. Most passengers settled into a rhythm now familiar to anyone who's flown before. Books opened, headphones slipped on, eyes closed in uneasy naps. But still, the atmosphere on Flight 227 was different. Even as time passed and the hum of the engines became background noise, no one truly looked away from row 2. Not completely. Lana had fallen back into a light sleep, curled slightly on her side, Her hand still knotted gently in Shadow's thick coat. Her chest rose and fell in steady, shallow breaths. Her color had returned slightly. The worst, it seemed, had passed. Shadow, meanwhile, remained unmoving. His eyes were open, ears relaxed but ready. He wasn't resting. Not really. Even in stillness, he was alert, monitoring each shift of the plane, each footstep down the aisle, each moment Lana stirred. His heartbeat, if one could have felt it, would have pulsed with the even rhythm of a trained sentinel. But outside that bubble of child and dog, the rest of the cabin was shifting in its quiet way. Passengers who had once avoided eye contact now found themselves watching and thinking. A woman in row 4 kept glancing toward Lana, her lips pressed together in a look that held more than sympathy. It held regret. Her teenage daughter sat beside her, sleeping peacefully, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her child's ear. A few rows behind, a man who'd earlier muttered complaints under his breath about entitled people with animals now stared out the window, jaw clenched, eyes blinking too much. He didn't look toward Lana again, but something about his posture, the way he sat straighter, the way his arms were no longer crossed, said everything. Sometimes shame is the beginning of transformation. Captain Hale remained in the cockpit, still silent, still alone. He hadn't spoken since that intercom announcement, and yet the cabin still felt his presence, or rather, his absence. That same voice, which had once denied a little girl safety, now lingered only in memory, overshadowed by the sound of a monitor beeping gently in row 2. But Hale wasn't avoiding for cowardice. Not now. He was thinking of his training, of the rules he had memorized, of the decisions he had made so automatically that they stopped feeling like choices. And most of all, he was thinking of the look. Lana's eyes, still tired but unafraid. The moment she turned toward the cockpit as the plane took off. The moment she let him see, not anger, not fear, but truth. He had failed her, not with malice, but with something worse, with indifference. That was the realization that hurt the most. In the back galley, First Officer Navarro leaned against the wall, watching the flight attendants quietly pass out drinks. He'd flown with Hale several times, knew his reputation, knew his pride. But this flight, it had changed something. Eli saw the way Hale sat behind that door now, not like a man in command, but like a man listening for the first time. He walked back toward row 2, pausing just near the bulkhead. He didn't say anything, just crouched down slowly near Shadow and looked the dog in the eyes. "You're doing all right, soldier," he said softly. Shadow blinked, acknowledging him with a slow, calm breath. Navarro didn't try to pet him. He didn't need to. This wasn't a moment for affection. It was a moment for recognition. A salute, not a pat. He stood, glanced once at Lana, still sleeping, and then returned to the front. Time passed. The plane cruised westward, slicing through clouds like a vessel guided by something stronger than wind. In row 2, Julia Brooks sat reading the same sentence of her paperback novel for the 12th time, her hand resting on her daughter's arm. And then something small happened. Lana stirred. Her eyes opened, slowly, cautiously. The world was blurred but familiar. She looked around, then downward. Shadow? He was there, already lifting his head, tail thumping gently against the floor. Julia leaned in. "Hey, sweet girl," she whispered. "You're all right. We're in the air. Everything's okay." Lana blinked again, processing. Her voice came out like dust. "Did we get to stay?" Her mother smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Lana's forehead. "Yes, honey. Shadow's right here. He's flying with you, just like he always does." Lana turned her head slightly, eyes full of wonder and something else. Relief. Not just that her seizure had passed. Not just that Shadow was beside her. But this time, when the world tried to push her out, she hadn't been alone. And then came the moment that would stay with the passengers forever. Lana reached for Shadow's face, cupped it gently and whispered, "You stayed, even when they said you couldn't." Shadow licked her knuckle once, then rested his chin softly on her lap. Behind them, a woman choked back a tear. In row 6, someone quietly put their phone away and just sat still. The world hadn't ended. But maybe Maybe it had cracked open just enough to let the light in. The announcement came just past midnight. Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our initial descent. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened, trays are up, and all electronic devices are stowed. Captain Hale's voice was steady, almost mechanical. Years of repetition wrapped in a layer of detachment. But beneath the practiced cadence, there was something new in his tone. Restraint, reflection, maybe even remorse. In row 2, Julia Brooks reached for her daughter's blanket and gently adjusted it across Lana's lap. Her fingers moved slowly, carefully, as if covering not just a sleeping child, but a healing wound. Lana had drifted in and out of consciousness since the episode. Her breathing was more regular now, her cheeks no longer pale like paper. And Shadow, ever faithful, ever present, remained curled against her legs, unmoving except for the subtle twitch of his ears at every shift in cabin pressure. As the plane began to dip gently through layers of dense cloud, turbulence returned, not violent but persistent, the kind that made overhead bins rattle and window panels groan softly under stress. The cabin responded the way most cabins do, passengers clutching armrests, glancing out windows, checking seatbelts. But this time, their eyes all seemed to return to one place. Row 2, the sight of Lana, calm and cradled in the loyalty of a dog that would not move. Even now, even at the edge of the unknown, anchored something inside them. What had once been called disruption now felt like grounding. No one looked away, not even the ones who had earlier looked down on her, not even Captain Hale. He could see the whole cabin from his monitor now. Each row, each face, each pocket of emotion that he had once filtered out in the name of efficiency. But row 2 pulled his gaze like gravity. He watched as Shadow shifted slightly, pressing himself closer into Lana's side as the plane trembled. He saw how Lana's hand, still resting in the dog's fur, twitched in recognition, how she tilted her head ever so slightly toward the window and whispered, "We're almost there, right?" Julia nodded, smiling gently through her exhaustion. "Almost there, baby." The plane descended lower. The lights of the city below blinked through the clouds, quiet constellations in organized grids, unaware of the lesson unfolding thousands of feet above. Then came the moment, the kind that doesn't make headlines but rewrites hearts. The flight attendant, young, nervous, and with trembling hands, returned to row 2. She crouched gently beside Shadow, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," she said. Shadow didn't move. He didn't wag. He simply looked at her. It was enough. The woman reached into her pocket and pulled out a small airline pin, the kind given to frequent flyers or kids traveling alone. She clipped it quietly onto Shadow's harness and stood up without another word. In row 5, an elderly man who had earlier scoffed about special treatment now cleared his throat and wiped at his eyes. "That dog flew steadier than the captain," he mumbled to no one in particular. But someone heard him. Captain Hale did. His hands tightened slightly on the yoke as the autopilot guided them through the final descent. The weight in his chest had grown heavier with every mile. And now as the wheels dropped and the runway lights came into focus, he understood what so many before him had tried to teach but he'd refused to hear. Rules don't protect people. People protect people. And sometimes it's the ones you try to exclude who are the most equipped to protect. The landing was smooth. The wheels kissed the runway with a soft thud, followed by the familiar rumble of deceleration. Passengers lurched gently forward, then settled back as the plane slowed, taxied, and rolled toward Gate 12. No one clapped, no cheers, just silence, still, thoughtful. The seatbelt sign pinged off, and yet no one rushed to stand. They waited, because they knew this time someone else would be the first to leave. As the paramedics reboarded to assist Lana, a quiet wave moved through the cabin. Passengers stepped back, stood up only to make room, heads bowed, arms lifted to clear bags from the path. Shadow rose with perfect coordination, moving only when Lana stirred. His steps were slow, measured, and practiced. A soldier leaving the battlefield, not defeated, but defined by what he had done. Lana, now more alert, blinked as she was wheeled down the aisle. The passengers didn't speak. They simply watched her go, some with hands folded over hearts, some with wet eyes, some just still. But all of them changed, all of them remembering. As they reached the front of the aircraft, the door to the cockpit opened. Captain Hale stepped out. No hat, no announcement, no illusion of control. Just a man who had watched a child collapse, who had denied her protection, and who now stood in front of the one he had tried to erase. He looked smaller out here, more human. His voice caught in his throat, but he forced it out anyway. "Miss Brooks." Lana looked up slowly. Hale crouched slightly to her level. "I was wrong." 3 words. Simple, but they held more weight than anything he'd ever said behind a closed door. "I didn't see you. I didn't see him. But I see you now, and I'm sorry." Lana didn't answer, but Shadow did. He stepped forward and laid his head gently against the captain's knee. The crowd saw it. They didn't need to cheer, because what they were witnessing wasn't a spectacle. It was redemption. The moment Lana and Shadow emerged from the jet bridge into the terminal, the world was waiting. Not just the fluorescent lights and wax tile floors. Not just the tired passengers dragging their luggage past baggage claim, but the world. Cameras flashed. News vans lined up outside. Reporters leaned over security ropes, holding microphones out like offerings. Somehow the story had spread. A little girl was denied boarding, a seizure, a service dog that refused to abandon her. But what captivated everyone wasn't just the injustice. It was the reversal. The moment the powerless stood tall and the powerful were forced to kneel. Julia Brooks walked beside her daughter, one hand on the wheelchair handle, the other gripping a medical folder now wrinkled and damp with sweat. She didn't try to shield Lana from the attention. Not this time. Because this time, the attention wasn't dangerous. It was witnessed. Lana sat up a little taller, her cheeks still pale, but her eyes alert. Shadow trotted calmly at her side, his black harness now scuffed with the wear of battle. But he looked unbothered, unshaken, steady. As they moved through the terminal, a hush fell. Airport employees stopped mid-task. Travelers froze with boarding passes in hand. One child dropped her juice box and whispered, "Is that the girl?" Yes, that was the girl, but more importantly, that was the dog. And together, they were now a symbol. Halfway through the terminal, a woman approached, not with a camera or a question, but with something far more honest. Tears in her eyes, a whisper in her voice. "My son has epilepsy," she said, "and I've spent years fighting for people to take it seriously. Thank you for what you did, both of you." Lana blinked. "I didn't do anything." "Yes, you did," the woman replied. "You made them see us." From that moment on, Lana didn't move through the airport like someone fragile. She moved like someone had seen. Outside, the air was crisp. Night had rolled in, but the lights overhead cast long, warm glows onto the pavement. A security escort waited to guide the family to a waiting van, arranged not by the airline, but by a civic group that had caught wind of what happened. A sign taped to the side window read, "Thank you, Shadow." Lana read it, then laughed, a soft, short, delighted sound. Shadow wagged his tail once. Before stepping into the vehicle, Lana turned back one last time. The glass doors of the terminal reflected the world she had just walked through. Cold stares turned warm, judgment turned quiet respect, apathy turned into applause. She saw something else too. Captain Hale. He stood just inside the terminal, his uniform slightly wrinkled now, his eyes unreadable. He wasn't performing. He wasn't defending. He was just standing, watching, remembering. Lana didn't wave, but she did nod. Once, small, final. And Captain Hale, once unflinching in rules, now humbled by truth, nodded back. That single moment, quiet and unspoken, was captured in a photo that would later circle the globe. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. Two figures, once on opposite sides of power, now united in something deeper than conflict: clarity. The next morning, the footage had already gone viral. News outlets framed it in different ways. Dog saves girl after airline refuses to let her board. Service animal shames airline into policy change. When rules hurt more than they help, the story of Lana and Shadow. But what people shared most wasn't the headline. It was the moment Shadow pressed his head into Captain Hale's knee, and the way Hale didn't flinch. It spoke louder than outrage, louder than corporate apologies. It was a moment of surrender, not to public opinion, but to truth. Later that week, the airline issued a statement, carefully worded, full of phrases like reviewing our procedures and renewing our commitment to accessibility. But tucked quietly within that email blast to passengers, just before the fine print, was a sentence no one expected. Effective immediately, all flight staff will undergo additional training on disability rights, implicit bias, and emergency accommodation procedures. And under that, special acknowledgement to Lana Brooks and Shadow for reminding us what real safety means. It wasn't enough, but it was something. And something is where change begins. Back in her quiet apartment 2 days later, Lana curled up on the couch with a blanket draped over her legs and Shadow's head on her lap. Julia stood in the kitchen, watching her daughter breathe easier than she had in weeks. No tension in her jaw, no tremble in her hands. She was home, and she had come home not just safe, but respected. Lana looked up from the tablet in her lap. "Mom? Yeah? Do you think they'll forget?" Julia walked over, sat down beside her, and kissed the top of her head. "No," she whispered, "not this time." Shadow thumped his tail once, just once, but it sounded like a drumbeat, a promise, a pulse. 2 weeks later, Gate B29 was quiet again. No camera crews, no reporters, just the usual shuffle of suitcases, the buzz of flight announcements, and the hum of travelers moving through another day. But if you listened closely, if you stood still long enough, you could feel something lingering in the air. Something had changed. The gate agent standing behind the counter, someone new, younger, softer in voice, glanced up as a girl walked past with a dog at her side. Not a big dog, not Shadow, but another service animal, guiding a teenager with visual impairment. No one stopped her. No one questioned her leash. The agent smiled and nodded. "Safe travels," she said simply. The girl smiled back. Somewhere Lana Brooks might have smiled too, because this was exactly the change she hadn't asked for, but had created. Meanwhile, Lana was sitting in a folding chair on a small stage in a middle school auditorium in Chicago. She wore a simple navy dress, a pin on her collar that read, "Not all heroes wear badges," and a quiet, nervous expression. Her fingers rested on Shadow's back, steadying herself, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar weight of being seen. They hadn't told her this would be a ceremony, just a small gathering to discuss accessibility in public spaces. But when the curtain opened and she saw the crowd, parents, school administrators, airline executives, and a few flight crew members from that very flight, she knew this was something more. At the podium, First Officer Eli Navarro adjusted the mic. His voice, clear and composed, carried across the room. "We're not here today because something went wrong," he said. "We're here because, despite that, something very right happened." He gestured toward Lana. "Because one girl and one dog reminded an entire industry what safety means." A murmur of agreement moved through the audience. A few people clapped quietly. Eli continued. "It's easy to hide behind policy, behind the rules, behind the procedure, but none of that can protect someone in crisis. It takes vigilance, empathy, and it takes courage, especially from those with the least power in the room." He turned to Lana. "Lana, you and Shadow showed all of us how to be better, and now it's our turn to listen." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small silver pin, wings the kind given to first-time flyers. But these weren't ordinary wings. They had been specially engraved, LB+S, loyalty beyond altitude. He handed them to her as the audience stood in a wave of quiet applause. No one cheered loudly, no one hollered, but every hand came together with sincerity. Julia Brooks wiped at her eyes, her smile full of quiet pride. Lana stood shaky, but upright. She didn't make a speech. She didn't need to. She just leaned down, kissed the top of Shadow's head, and whispered, "We did it." In the days that followed, photos from the event spread, but the one that stayed etched in memory was this. Lana standing at center stage, her fingers lightly resting on Shadow's harness, her head tilted slightly, Not in defiance, but in grace. Shadow beside her, noble and unmoving. A girl and her dog. That image made its way to airline training manuals, to school classrooms, to the conference stages, and to one frame photo placed just inside the entrance of the airline's headquarters, under a plaque that read, Gate B29, where we learned again to see. As for Captain Hale, he didn't retire, he didn't vanish, he stayed, and he changed. He enrolled himself without being asked into an intensive disability advocacy seminar hosted by an independent group of passengers and educators. At the first session, he walked in quietly, took a seat near the back, and listened. When asked why he was there, he simply said, "Because I flew a plane through a storm once. But the strongest thing on board wasn't me. It was 12 years old, 85 pounds, and had 4 legs." Months later, he and Lana met again. No cameras, no audience. Just the two of them in a quiet corner of a small Chicago park. Lana sat on a bench. Shadow lay curled beside her, his nose tucked into his paws. Hale approached slowly, hat in his hands. "I didn't expect to be invited," he said softly. "I didn't invite you," Lana replied, her lips curling just slightly. "But I'm glad you came." He sat down beside her. They watched a few ducks land on the pond. A child nearby laughed as bubbles floated past. And then, after several long, silent minutes, Hale spoke. "I think about that flight every day," he said. "And every day, I wish I had seen you sooner." Lana didn't look at him. She didn't have to. "I think maybe—" "You weren't supposed to see me first," she said. "You were supposed to see Shadow." She leaned down, kissed the top of his head, and added, "He's hard to ignore." Hale smiled. "That he is." They sat there a while longer, then parted with no fanfare, just a nod. Just respect. In the years that followed, Lana grew. So did Shadow. He slowed down, his once sleek coat now peppered with gray. But he still walked proudly at her side, even when the walks became shorter. When he finally passed, the world mourned more than just a dog. They mourned a guardian, a soldier, a truth teller. But more than that, they remembered. Because the world doesn't always change through shouting. Sometimes it changes when someone stays quietly, when no one else will. Shadow stayed. And because he did, so did Lana. This story reminds us that true strength doesn't always come in loud voices or commanding uniforms. It often shows itself in silence, in loyalty, and in those who are dismissed, doubted, or overlooked. Lana and Shadow taught the world a lesson far more powerful than any policy manual or corporate regulation. Human dignity is not a privilege, it's a right, and those who protect it, especially when no one else will, are the ones we should trust most. In a world where it's easy to follow rules blindly, we are called to look deeper, to recognize the quiet heroes, to listen when it's inconvenient, and to protect the vulnerable not because we're told to, but because it's the right thing to do. Because sometimes the most powerful revolution starts with a girl, a dog, and a moment when someone simply refuses to look away.